You're listening to the Contemplative Light podcast with your host, Clint Sabom.
Hey, and welcome to the Contemplative Light podcast. I'm your host, Clint Sabom. Contemplative Light is a community of inner spiritual teachers rooted in the Christian contemplative tradition, providing resources for the healing of persons. Contemplative Light, mystical practice, inner transformation. And this podcast is brought to you by our course on contemplative practices. You can visit us at contemplativelight.com and click on our courses to learn more about our on-demand teachings, about the rich mystical practices of the Christian tradition. And speaking of the Christian tradition, some people sometimes that get into contemplative spirituality, or they were brought up in a traditional Christian environment and they get into meditation and deeper levels of consciousness and spiritual growth, often wonder how can this be reconciled with Christian theology. And recently I interviewed Paul Smith of Integral Christianity, who had a very good perspective on that. And in this episode I interviewed Daniel Coleman, who wrote a book called Presence and Process, which is a deep dive into process theology, which stems off of many of the ideas of 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. So for those of you interested in theology and philosophy and new ways of looking at things and new ways of understanding Christian frameworks that lend themselves to the contemplative life, or for those of you just interested in learning more and growing more, this is going to be a very interesting episode to listen to. So, hope you enjoy. Hey, so we're talking with Daniel Coleman. Good to have you on today.
Well, thanks, Clint. I appreciate it.
So, for listeners that aren't familiar, do you want to go ahead and give a brief introduction of yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, a little bit about me. I live in Seattle, Washington. I've lived here about 20 years. I grew up in Denver, Colorado. My parents are English. They emigrated from England to Canada, and Canada to the U.S. And I suppose as a result of that background, I was raised in a very non-religious environment. They had grown up sort of under the Anglican Church and had moved away from that. So I grew up in a very non-religious environment. When I was a young adult, in my early 20s, I was traveling around the country, playing in a heavy metal band, and had a spiritual experience, and decided to become a Christian. I had no idea what that meant, but a friend led me in the sinner's prayer, and about the only thing I knew about Jesus at that time, having quite honestly never been to church except maybe once as a child. About the only thing I knew was he was some guy who died on a cross. So, but I became a Christian and spent the next 25 years or so in the evangelical sort of charismatic fundamentalist Christian world, and eventually, just as I continued to grow and mature and read and ask questions and things, I sort of broadened out from that. My wife and I eventually left that world and became Quakers, and spent about 10 or 12 years among Quakers, which was a wonderful experience. And that was my introduction to contemplative spirituality. And that just continued to open on up. And as part of that journey, I went to get my master's degree in theology at the Earlham School of Religion, which is a Quaker seminary in Indiana. And in the completion of that, I wrote my master's thesis on the interrelationship between contemplative spirituality, both Christian and Buddhist, and process theology. And after completing all of that, a Quaker publisher, Barclay Press, expressed an interest in publishing that thesis as a book. So I sort of rewrote it, tried to make it a bit less thesis-like, and they then published that as my book, Presence and Process.
So what exactly is process theology?
Process theology is very much an emerging school of theology. It's becoming more and more known and embraced by folks from all kinds of different faith backgrounds, Christians, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, you name it. And it sort of goes back to a school of philosophy known as process philosophy, which was developed by a gentleman in the 20th century by the name of Alfred North Whitehead, who was a mathematician, philosopher, bit of a theologian, etc. He's very well known for co-writing a huge volume on mathematics with Bertrand Russell. And what process philosophy was about was sort of taking philosophy back to some of the original questions and looking at them through new lenses. So much of philosophy is based in Greek philosophical concepts, which, we can go back to Aristotle, for example. The idea of that our world is made of substance and substances, and the variations off of that, such as Plotinus and Neoplatonism, which had a huge effect on classical Christian theology. That the idea of that there's something called the One, which is sort of analogous to God, and all of reality is an emanation from the One in various stages, various strengths, or various levels of attenuation that become less and less like the One. So the idea of viewing the world as substance, and so everything is made up of things. The early Greek atomist philosophers who postulated that everything is made up of tiny little things they called atoms that congregate together to create forms and things like that, which is amazing that they were able to see that. And that then that idea of a substantialist way of viewing the world is comprised of substance, and all the philosophies that were built on that. Whitehead said, what if instead, based on what we know now, instead of thinking of the world, the universe, reality as substance, what if we think of it as process, as events? Kind of makes sense if we look at an atom, or observe an atom to the degree we're able to. If we realize that an atom is not a thing per se, but it's an event, and that event then leads to other events, or it's a process. And everything in the universe we can think of really as processes, not so much as things. So that tree growing in the yard, it's a process. It's a very slow process. So we think of it as a thing, but it's a process. And, it starts as a seed and then a sapling, and then it grows into a tree. It matures and it goes through various forms, transformations seasonally, and then eventually it will die and decompose and etc. A human or a dog or a rock, anything is really in process. And so Whitehead came up with some really interesting jargon to go along with this. For example, he would refer to a person not as a thing, but as an occasion or an event. He would say that a person is an occasion of being or an actual occasion. And if we start to, it can really be a bit of a mind blower when you start to dig into this idea of thinking of reality as process rather than as substance, as verb rather than as noun. But it provides some interesting inroads into mysticism, contemplation, and contemplative spirituality. So Whitehead's process philosophy has been gaining over the years more and more adherents in the academic realm, and that then bled into theology. And so now there's or has been for a while now, an emerging school of process theology, taking these same concepts and now applying them into theology in a similar way that the old Greek substantialist philosophies were imported into Christian theology and had a huge effect on the shaping of Christian theology. So Augustine, for example, was massively influenced by Neoplatonism, and so it's kind of going back to some of those original questions and revisiting them from a completely different perspective of looking at the world. And it has some surprising and really exciting results.
I'm curious now what you think of Thomas Aquinas. Do you think he sided with Aristotle too much and the whole Aristotle-Plato? Because I say that because I kind of find myself much more Neoplatonic than Aristotelian, and most of the people, you mentioned Whitehead, and I'm a big reader of Ken Wilber as well, and a lot of these guys seem much more influenced by Plato. Do you have an opinion on Aquinas? Did he miss the call? I guess because he's the godfather of orthodoxy,
Yeah. Well, I don't know, and I certainly don't consider myself a scholar of Aquinas, so I would be offering sort of a more of a layman's opinion when it comes to that. I think that Aquinas, in part, his thinking was a product of the time and of the rediscovery of so much of that ancient, the ancient Greek philosophy and writing and all of the excitement around that. I'm fascinated by where Aquinas ended up, which seemed to be after such rigorous philosophical pursuit for so many years, he seemed to come to the place of letting all of that go and embracing the mystery, which is quite fascinating. Are you still there? Did I lose you?
Yeah, once Aquinas started having his own mystical experiences, he kind of threw his own masterwork under the bus. But to basically go to process theology, I'm curious as far as some of the ways in which you talked about it are interesting to me, because I've often thought that theology became or becomes more of a block often for Christians going into the contemplative path ultimately than it becomes something that is a catalyst for contemplative growth, simply because perhaps beliefs and ideas are often part of the mind's doing, and the idea is to perceive God not using the mind. So I'm wondering how process theology understands the contemplative path of waking up, the mystical path, as far as like Evelyn Underhill came up with, stuff like that.
Sure. And, you know, it's interesting, of course, that, you know, the great mystics of the past, you know, from, you know, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, or, you know, Pseudo Dionysius, or Evagrius, etc., were very much philosophically, theologically of that more substantialist mindset, and though, you know, very influenced by Plotinus and Neoplatonism. So they're great. Some of the great mystics and great teachers of mysticism, you know, were operating under that philosophical construct. But what I found is invigorating and exciting, hopeful about process theology is that it puts the emphasis on the here and now, on this moment. And the idea in process theology is that the past doesn't exist. All we have of the past is data, artifacts, results, traces, etc. The future doesn't exist. The future is only possibilities and probabilities. The only thing that really exists is this moment. But this moment is constantly becoming the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. And so we're riding this wave of the present moment continuously. But God is also riding this wave of the present moment with us continuously. Process theology would posit that, I don't know if you've ever seen the old wood carvings of God, you know, sitting at a desk with a scroll rolled out, and the scroll is the scroll of time, and there God is outside of time, looking at the past and the present and the future all together. And God has already written the story, the entire scroll, and the future is pre-written, predetermined, etc. Process theology would say that no, God exists right now in the present moment, as we do, as the universe does. And God does not know the future. God knows everything that exists, but the future doesn't exist yet. And so God is journeying through time and through the present moment with us, and continuously providing input into a vision of what the future could be, and whether that's the future 5 minutes from now, or 5 years from now, or 500 years from now. That God's, although God in a sense is reactive and consequent and adjusts to what's happening, and is utterly relational with everything in our world, in our universe, from, you know, the greatest thing to the smallest thing. God is utterly relational and interactive and involved, and God is constantly feeding input based on what God's intention is of what it could be, what this moment could be, what this next moment could be, again, both on a micro and macro scale. So then this idea of God as this relational being who doesn't rule by coercion, by mandate, but instead guides by persuasion, by was I thinking of something the author of The Cloud of Unknowing wrote about the gentle stirring of love in our hearts that we follow wherever it leads us. And he talked about that as being a sure guide in this life. That's this idea of how God is in every moment, in every now, providing that. And then we have the opportunity to respond to that and to position ourselves in such a way that we can discern those gentle stirrings of love that God is constantly providing, constantly feeding. And then we can respond to those and make choices that are in conformity with what God's intention is. And so it becomes a very active way of practicing our faith that really fits hand in glove with contemplative spirituality.
Wow. So how does all that become incorporated in contemplative practice?
So an example would be if we think of apophatic spiritual practice, the idea where we're letting go of thoughts and concepts and things, and we're seeking to just be in the presence of God in sort of an undifferentiated manner. And as Thomas Keating taught or teaches in Centering Prayer, the idea is that we're surrendering ourselves to God and to the activity, the transformative activity of the Holy Spirit within us. And I'm speaking in theistic terms here, but we could just as easily speak in non-theistic terms, say from a Buddhist perspective. But the idea that we're submitting ourselves, opening ourselves to inner transformation, and we're learning to see reality for what it is, not be deluded by the stream of thoughts and narratives that are constantly running through our head, but to be able to see reality and discern things as they actually are, and then respond to that. Again, Whitehead wrote something really interesting that has been proven by neuroscience, which is that there's a very small percentage of what goes on in our brains that we're actually aware of. Right? There's just a small percentage that bubbles up to the level of consciousness. And there's a tremendous amount that is going on below the level of consciousness. And, in that area, that subconscious level, again, God is speaking to us. And in apophatic spirituality, where we're just resting in the presence of God in an undifferentiated manner, we're opening ourselves to a lot of that stuff that we're not even aware of is going on beneath that conscious level, but it starts to bubble up, perhaps in how we find ourselves to have more of a to be just in a more serene state, to have more equanimity about what's going on around us, or to find that we seem to have more compassion towards others and towards ourselves. Or we seem to be able to feel a sense of distance between our feelings and our actions, so that, when that driver cuts me off on the road, instead of instantly being angry and reacting, there's a gap there where I can say, that kind of made me feel angry. I wonder what I should do about that. I should probably just let that go. He's probably having a bad day. And, all of these tangible effects in our life that come from this place of, to use classical Christian apophatic terminology, they come from this place of divine darkness.
Yes, Pseudo-Dionysus talks about that, huh?
Oh yeah, very much so. and of course, the cloud of unknowing, this idea of, the author of the Cloud of Unknowing, who is very much influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius, who kind of painted this picture of that we stand between two clouds. There's the cloud of forgetting below us, where we're letting go of rational thoughts and concepts and ideas during the time that we're practicing our meditation, our contemplation. So there's a cloud of forgetting below, and there's the cloud of unknowing that we're reaching towards, which is again this idea of simply being in the present moment, in the presence of God. And so again, that process theology and that idea of that being in the presence of God here and now, they really fit together well. And in a sense, and this was the surprising thing for me, is I was pursuing these as two separate things, and it started to dawn on me how much they converged. That in a sense, contemplative spirituality, that's the where the rubber meets the road. That's the practice. That's the actual, tangible, practical doing it. But the process theology provides this wonderful, rich, theological and philosophical underpinning, which certainly isn't required or necessary, but it fits really well and provides lots and lots of food for rumination and consideration.
Sure. I'm thinking now of a line from a Zen sutra that says, the stillness is in the moving itself. And much of what you're saying seems very Zen or very even Taoist in a sense as well. I'm wondering how, process theology, or how you go about articulating process theology from an Eastern perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's there really are the convergence of these things is really remarkable. It's funny you would mention that in the book Impermanence and Process. I begin the chapter on process theology with a quote from Soyen Shaku, a Zen Buddhist monk. And I'll read it real quick if you don't mind. It's super short.
Sure, that'd be great. I love those.
So in a lecture entitled "The God Conception of Buddhism," given during his tour of the United States in 1905, the Zen Buddhist monk Soyen Shaku made the following statement. At the outset, let me state that Buddhism is not atheistic as the term is ordinarily understood. It has certainly a God, the highest reality and truth, through which and in which this universe exists. However, the followers of Buddhism usually avoid the term God, for it savors so much of Christianity, whose spirit is not always exactly in accord with the Buddhist interpretation of religious experience. Again, Buddhism is not pantheistic in the sense that it identifies the universe with God. On the other hand, the Buddhist God is absolute and transcendent. This world being merely its manifestation is necessarily fragmented and imperfect. To define more exactly the Buddhist notion of the highest being, it may be convenient to borrow the term very happily coined by a modern German scholar, panentheism, according to which God is all and one, more than the totality of existence. And it goes on from there, but so the idea is, and I don't think I mentioned earlier that panentheism is really a fundamental aspect of process theology. And so when Buddhist scholars, teachers, monks, etc., were reading European philosophy on panentheism, they were looking at it and they were saying, well, yeah, of course, exactly. That's exactly how we see the world. And likewise, then as it developed more and more into process theology and became more refined and defined, Buddhists tend to look at that and say, well, of course, yes, it fits. The ideas such as impermanence, that the entire universe, everything arises and then ceases continuously, so contingent arising. And then the idea of our meditative practice as learning to perceive that flux and that flow, and as a result of that perception and the impact that it has on us, then our tendency towards grasping and craving and clinging to things lessens, because we realize that it's all flux and flow arising and ceasing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I always view Christianity as panentheistic. However, traditionally, it's not necessarily understood that way. I mean, if I'm right, I mean, let me know if this is right. But panentheism is where you take away the world and you still have God, but God is also in the world, so it's almost both. And it seems like Western religion has tended more towards, I guess, theism, where God's not so much in the world, but if you take away the world, you still have God.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way of putting it. I almost think of it as a continuum, where at one end you've got strict monotheism, and at the other end you've got pure pantheism, and then panentheism is somewhere sort of in the middle. The idea that everything that we experience, the universe, is in God, but also that God transcends the universe and everything in it. So I've had some interesting conversations recently, and I'm still working through it, about just how different is panentheism from pantheism, and where is that line drawn? And I think that's where I'm at this point, is the idea that it's still in panentheism, as you said, this idea that God does transcend creation, transcends the universe.
Sure. Well, there's, I've heard it put like the unmanifest and the manifest, the emptiness and the form, and kind of at the center of at the origin point, there is an emptiness, meaning it's devoid of form, and the natural world is, or at least what we can. Well, yeah, I mean, it does get tricky to explain philosophically, but I guess the point would just be the difference between impermanence and eternity,
Yeah, and this is what's exciting to me is that we live in a time and a place where a lot of these ideas are converging together, and so where a person who has been an evangelical Christian for several decades can come to a place where they can simultaneously consider themselves a Buddhist, as I do, and can simultaneously see the truth and appreciate the truth in Taoism and in all of these different expressions, and then look at challenging philosophical, theological ideas such as process theology, and see how that's likewise attempting to describe these different things. And it's really exciting to be where we are now, where we have the opportunity to explore these things that once upon a time were very much segregated by culture and distance, et cetera, and start to see how they interact with one another in such a positive way.
Sure. So now I'm getting curious about your own path, just because for myself, I had a big mystical experience when I was 21, and while it's been difficult to integrate, there was almost a sense of I was just basically screwed at that point. Like I could try to pretend that the world was narrower, but I really couldn't fool myself because I'd seen it. So it was kind of like the gig was up, and I'm kind of curious. So I guess that's why I always had a difficulty with conventional or more traditional religion. I mean, I always liked monasteries and monks and that whole vibe, but traditional religion, just often doesn't mention that a whole lot. And so I guess that's a long way of asking what keeps people and what kept you from, being able to, whether it's psychologically or spiritually or intellectually, make the leap from, being more of a kind of evangelical Christian to someone that was more open to something like the perennial philosophy, because it seems like there's a huge gulf there for some people, almost to the extent that there still seems to be some pushback in terms of, well, once you get to a point having a conversation we're having, you're not even really in the Christian community anymore. So there's a bit, but you also at the same time, like you mentioned, get people that are in that at some point, but then just kind of, I guess, grow through it. So I guess, what's necessary along that road, and what was that path like for you in terms of just internally?
Yeah. And it is interesting. I mean, certainly a lot of my old friends from the more fundamentalist days, consider me a heretic and a lost cause, and et cetera, because that world, that expression of faith was very much about drawing boundaries, and there was tended to be a lot of fear involved about transgressing boundaries and things like that. So, for example, we were often told, we were told that, well, what Buddhism teaches is that you're supposed to empty your mind, but if you empty your mind, then Satan or demons are going to enter your mind. You're leaving yourself open for attack. So don't even go there. So it's kind of a very fear-based orientation, which is interesting when you start to look at things like what, that Jesus taught, that, it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, but it's what comes out, the thoughts of the heart. And it's sort of like, so that would seem to imply, as the early Christian mystics realized, that it's actually our thoughts that get us into trouble. And if we can find a way of not, of minimizing or of putting those thoughts in the background a bit, it's actually going to be beneficial to us. I came into it, as I mentioned, with no religious background whatsoever. And I can recall as a brand new baby Christian, on the road in a hotel room as a bass player in a heavy metal band. So, completely. And I can recall getting the phone book and calling up churches and asking them random questions because I had no idea. I was like, okay, so explain to me now, who's this Jesus guy? And what's the deal with the whole cross thing? And, and I mean, just starting from scratch. So I was calling myself a Christian because I had prayed the prayer, made the transaction, I guess, and but really didn't know what that meant. And I came home from traveling on the road and started going to a church. And that church, they said, basically, we have the answers. We know what the answers are, and it's all in this book, the Bible, and we understand how to interpret this book. Those other folks over there don't. they're dangerous, so don't, listen to them, listen to us. We know. And so I thought, okay, these guys seem to know what they're talking about. They seem very sure about what they're saying. So I guess this must be what it means to be a Christian. And so I spent many years imbibing that, because they were the voices of authority who said, this is what it means to be a Christian. And so that shaped my, not just theological views, but how I viewed other people. Came to view humankind as hopelessly lost and destined for hell. How I viewed the present time, that we were surely living in the end times, and any day now, the rapture was going to occur, and all of that. How I viewed people's roles in society, whether it was LGBTQ folks or whether it was, the role of women in the church and in the world, et cetera. It kind of shaped all of that. And a lot of it was fear-based. It was being not just taught these things, but taught, if you transgress these things, if you don't believe these things, then you're in great spiritual peril. And then there's also the power of community. When you're part of a community and you're ensconced in that community, and as my wife and I learned the hard way, if you start to ask difficult questions or voice disagreement with things, you may find yourself ostracized and outside of the community, which is, a very painful thing. So it was a long, gradual process for me of bridging that gulf. And interestingly enough, the impetus for starting down that road was when I started to read and study the Bible for myself, rather than just taking in what I was being told in sermons and such. And as I became more and more of a self-taught, I guess, Bible scholar, and we live in such a wonderful time that there's so much available to us. You can access some of the greatest Bible scholars in the world, of all kinds of different persuasions. And one of the first things you realize is, oh, there's a whole bunch of different ways to look at this. This particular theological topic, I was taught that there's only one way to look at it, but it turns out all these other folks who seem very knowledgeable and experienced, they see it from a different way, and from several different ways. Maybe I need to be less dogmatic and more open to, considering different viewpoints, and that gradually over time leads into, feeling a sense of freedom to explore ideas. There's a joke told among seminarians, which is, how many times did you lose your faith while you were in seminary?
Yeah. And many of them never go into the priesthood after seminary too.
Well, yeah, because one of the things that is sure to be chipped away at is is that dogmatic sense of, no, there's only one right way, and I happen to know what it is, and all these other folks, are deceived or wrong or whatever. I can recall, a pastor of a church I was part of for many years who referred to seminary as cemetery. And he would rail against it in sermons. If you go to cemetery, you will lose your faith. And he was absolutely right. You will lose that faith, that fundamentalist, very kind of narrow faith. You'll lose it, and that's a good thing. So yeah, for me, it was very much a gradual process of starting to realize maybe these voices who claimed to have all the answers, maybe they really didn't, and maybe there's not as much to be afraid of as they say, and maybe there's other ways of looking at this, and what are those other ways? And then starting to evaluate different views and ideas and saying, well, that makes a lot of sense to me, and this one maybe that's an interesting, et cetera. And then pretty soon you find that you're off on this path of exploration, and it's exciting, and who knows where it will lead you to. You may come to a point where you're very comfortable saying, I'm a Christian and a Buddhist.
Sure.
And once upon a time, that would have been inconceivable.
Right. Well, one thing I want to zero in on, there's so much in everything you just said that interests me as stuff to talk about. But the thing I want to zero in on is what you were saying about emptiness, because, well, number one, I found that, meditations on the emptiness and form and wisdom, in a sense, being how well you understand emptiness. All that has been extremely helpful in my path and extremely positive. However, there is a big fear, I think, and it may be more of just a Western mindset than a Christian mindset, or not only a Christian mindset, but a Western mindset too, where, the emptiness, the nothingness is negative, and you want God and Jesus, which is positive. So it's almost like addition. And I remember thinking of that even when I was a little kid. It's like you're learning addition and subtraction, and you see plus, I would see plus signs and think, oh yeah. And then I'd see minus signs and I'd think, oh no, so that's really kind of built in. And meditating on the emptiness, which is basically the unmanifest, which is basically the infinite, not based on time, which is basically God. That's what the emptiness is opening and ever unfolding, very much like you described process theology, and yet you have this intense fear in many. And I've had even coaching clients that had real problems with emptying their mind or going into silence, because it had been so drilled into them. You start emptying your mind, the demons are going to jump in. And of course, the first thing I'd ask would be, well, when you emptied your mind, did the demons jump in? Did you feel the demons? And they'd be like, no, I kind of felt relaxed, but then I got scared that the demons were, going to come. And that's a big fear, I think, in a lot of people. And there's a big kind of negative connotation with that emptiness. And I'm not even sure I understand the roots of it in Christianity. You probably understand it much better than I. So, I mean, if you don't mind speaking on that might be real helpful for some of the listeners.
Yeah. No, and it's true. It's very much a fear that is, I think, implanted. Part of it, gosh, there's so many aspects to that. I think part of it, first off, is human nature. We are consumeristic. We are acquisitive. We want to acquire things. We want to surround ourselves with things and have things. I think that's, to a large degree, human nature. And it's a fascinating experience for me in the time I was in the Quaker world was I spent a lot of time with some very elderly Quakers, what Quakers would refer to as weighty friends, who had a great deal of experience and seasoning and authority, and it was so helpful to me to watch these folks as they age be very intentional about letting go of things in their lives, and at a certain point saying, I really shouldn't be driving anymore. I can't see very well. I need to let that go. And then saying, it's time for me to downsize into a smaller living space. And, I don't need all these books anymore. I don't, et cetera. And being very, very intentional about it. Tremendous wisdom. And I learned a lot from that. But it goes against the grain of, certainly in our culture, how we tend to be. So there's that side of it. And And I think that's also where there's a lot of draw currently towards mindfulness and towards Buddhist practice, because that realization that acquiring things does not fill the hole. It's not working. So there's that part of it. Then the other part of it is certainly Protestant Christianity really emphasizes a cataphatic approach. The difference between cataphatic and apophatic, where cataphatic
that's it, I think.
Yeah, and so, whereas apophatic, which is, Christian contemplative practice generally, and Buddhist meditative practice generally, is about letting go of things and embracing silence and stillness and stepping back from the thought stream that's constantly running in our head. That's the apophatic, whereas the cataphatic is about employing things in our spirituality. So we're going to have all kinds of pictures and ideas and concepts and words and all of these things. And so you go to a typical Protestant Sunday morning church service, and there is no or almost no moment of silence whatsoever. In fact, it's like we can't have any dead air. We need to fill any point of silence. That years ago, there was a Christian pastor who came out with a teaching on the Lord's Prayer. And this was back when I was part of the fundamentalist evangelical church. And this teaching kind of made a big splash. And what it was a sheet on the Lord's Prayer and how to pray the Lord's Prayer. And the idea was you would begin by praying, Our Father, and then you would kind of improvise off of that. Our Father, what does that mean? And so now you'd be praying, well, God, it means you are my Father, and that means this, and that means who art in heaven. And then you would elaborate on that, and you'd go through the entire Lord's Prayer, elaborating on every part of it, and amazingly, you would find quite easily that you could pray for a good 2 hours straight, constantly talking to God, telling God all about God's self, and never being quiet. It was constantly expressing these ideas. And that, I look back on that now as sort of the epitome of cataphatic prayer. It was all about, thinking about and expressing these ideas about God. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? The cataphatic and the apophatic aren't in opposition to each other. They're just two different ways of doing it, which tend to lead to different results. And oftentimes one can lead into the other, such as Lectio Divina, which begins cataphatic and gradually transitions to apophatic into holy silence. So I don't want to, appear to be painting cataphatic as a bad thing, but I think it has certainly been overemphasized certainly in the Protestant Christian world that I'm most familiar with. And so as a result, there's a great deal of discomfort with silence and with contemplative silence unless people are taught what the benefits of it are and how to enter into contemplative silence. It's wonderful, as worshiping with Quakers for so many years. Of course, the Quaker practice of gathering together and sitting together in group silence, and it's a listening silence. You're listening to the silence, and it's such a powerful, profound experience. But it's very much kind of a microscopically small minority of the Protestant Christian world that has that experience. So, yeah, I think there's a wonderful need and opportunity, and it's certainly part of why I wrote the book, and I think it's part of why you do what you do. Is there's a need and an opportunity, and I think a hunger out there for folks to learn how to, or to be exposed to these ideas and these practices, and then to respond to the draw, to the leading of God towards stillness and silence and contemplation.
Sure. Yeah, there's a strong need for it, and I also believe it's almost like, the future doesn't exist, but the future is going to contemplative spirituality if it decides to exist. And we don't want to lose Christianity in that mix, because I think so many people that get into meditation and yoga and consciousness and waking up are often tempted to just, throw out Christianity. Okay, well, that's not what that was, so they just kind of toss it all together. So in a sense, it's kind of making Christianity kind of stay relevant as we kind of go deeper.
It can. I think, and part of what I postulate about the future is that this is a way forward for Christianity. We live in a time now where, at least in the West, Christianity is on the decline in terms of people who identify as Christian, and in terms of the influence that Christianity has upon culture. We're seeing that in the U.S. to the point that it's become undeniable, and that's a continuation of what's been occurring in England, or in Europe and England for quite some time. Where those cultures are now considered post-Christian, and in our culture, it's given. We have names for it now. We have the nuns and the duns. So we have the nuns, which is a rapidly increasing percentage of young adults who say that their religious affiliation is nun. And the duns is older, typically very mature Christians who spent years and years and years in the church, who get to a point of saying, I'm done, and leaving the institutional church. And at the same time that that's going on, we also see this tremendous rise in the mindfulness movement, and an insight meditation and interest in Buddhist-derived mindfulness practice, and also to a lesser extent in Christian contemplative practice, be that centering prayer, Christian meditation, Christian Zen, etc. And so there's an interesting thing going on there where we see this decline of Christianity, or folks identifying as Christian, and we see this increase in interest in contemplative meditative practice. But they don't have to be exclusive. It doesn't have to be either or. And I love how so often Christian contemplative teachers, folks like Thomas Keating or Richard Rohr, etc., will go hand in hand with Buddhist teachers, be it Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama, or et cetera, because they recognize in each other an affinity and a commonality, that we're all experiencing the same thing. We're just using kind of different language to describe it, but we're all swimming in the same pool. And so there's then the lines on one hand aren't as clear and uncrossable, but on the other hand, I find that being a Christian to me is much more meaningful now because it's an active part of my everyday life rather than just agreeing to some theological or doctrinal ideas, or it's not based on a transaction that occurred 2,000 years ago on the cross, but rather it's based on what I'm doing every moment of my life. And so then it's possible to have that dual belonging, or belonging in multiple faiths with no contradiction, and to have a great deal of respect and appreciation for other expressions, whether it's the Sufis, or whether it's Hindu, or whether it's Native American spiritualities, etc. One doesn't have to put up these fences and barricades to protect oneself from them. But one still has their own spiritual identity that doesn't get lost or diluted. In fact, in a lot of ways, it becomes clearer.
Yeah, definitely. So we have so much to talk about. You definitely have to come back and do another interview later.
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah. We have so much here, but for now, I think this will wrap things up, and we're going to put a link to your book under this episode. And again, it's been great having you. And anything you want to say before we sign off?
Well, I guess a good kind of central point for a lot of the things that I've talked about is I have a website, which is danielpcoleman.com. Everybody calls me Danny, but my official author name is danielpcoleman.com. And on my website there, I also have links to where the book Presence and Process can be purchased. There's some links to some videos that I've done and put on YouTube that are an introduction to process theology. And then in the book itself, at the end of it, I have a list of recommended reading on topics ranging from process theology to Christian contemplation to Buddhism, etc. So
you have some videos, your videos on YouTube. If you also just typed in search Daniel P. Coleman into the search bar, you those would come up, you think?
I don't think they would, because at the time I posted them, where I posted them under the YouTube handle of Dan the Quaker, D-A-N, Dan the Quaker. So if someone were to search on Dan the Quaker and then process theology, or if you just search, there aren't, surprisingly, there aren't that many process theology videos on YouTube, although they... Surprise.
You think that's what everybody wants.
The list they are growing. It's really neat to see more and more of them out there, and from some tremendous world-class process theologians whose books have been a great source for me. If you were to just on YouTube search process theology introduction, you'll find it that way as well. Or go to danielpcoleman.com, and on that site I have links to the process theology videos.
Excellent. So you can just start to dominate that niche, maybe, process theology.
There are so many wonderful teachers and folks who, these are professors of philosophy and theology who this is their thing, and they go so far beyond anything I could aspire to. There's wonderful resources out there.
Sure. Well, that's great. So danielpcoleman.com, and book is Presence and Process?
Yep. Presence and Process, A Path Toward Transformative Faith and Inclusive Community.
Awesome. Okay, well, good talking to you, and we will be in touch.
Well, likewise, Clint. I really appreciate it and enjoy the conversation very much.
Me too. Take care, Danny.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.